The dawn of the 18th century witnessed the eruption of a conflict that would redefine the balance of power in Northern Europe. This was the Great Northern War, a struggle for supremacy in the Baltic region. On one side stood the formidable Swedish Empire, a military titan of the age, led by its young and brilliant warrior king, Charles XII. Sweden had known little but victory. On the other side, a coalition of nations chafed under Swedish dominance, eager to reclaim lost territories. Chief among them was the burgeoning Tsardom of Russia, a sleeping giant stirring under the ambitious rule of Peter the Great. Peter envisioned a new Russia, a modern European power with access to the sea. To achieve this, he needed to break Sweden's stranglehold on the Baltic coast. The initial years of the war were a disaster for the anti-Swedish coalition. Charles XII, a master of swift, decisive campaigns, inflicted a series of humiliating defeats upon his enemies, crushed the Danes, routed the Russians at Narva, and dethroned the Polish king. With his continental foes seemingly subdued, Charles turned his gaze toward the heart of Russia itself. In 1707, he launched his fateful invasion, a campaign from which his empire would never recover. Peter the Great, having learned bitter lessons from his earlier defeats, had not been idle. He had spent years rebuilding and modernizing his army along Western European lines. He implemented new training techniques, commissioned a modern artillery, and instilled a new sense of discipline. As the Swedes advanced, the Russians employed scorched earth tactics, a brutal but effective strategy. They burned villages, destroyed crops, and poisoned wells, denying the invaders sustenance. The Swedish army, accustomed to living off the land, began to feel the gnawing pangs of hunger. Then came the winter of 1708 to 1709, one of the most brutal in recorded history. Temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows, and the great frost descended upon Eastern Europe. The Swedish soldiers, ill-equipped for such a climate, suffered immensely. Thousands perished from frostbite, starvation, and disease. The once invincible Karolian army was being systematically destroyed, not by bullets, but by the merciless Russian winter. A critical blow came at the Battle of Lesnaya, where Peter intercepted and destroyed a crucial Swedish supply column. This defeat, which Peter called the Mother of the Poltava victory, sealed the fate of Charles's main army. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, Charles made a desperate gamble. He turned south, towards the fertile lands of Ukraine, seeking an alliance with the Cossack hetman, Ivan Mazepa. Mazepa, hoping to secure Ukrainian independence from Russia, promised support. However, the support he could muster was far less than Charles had hoped. By the spring of 1709, the Swedish army was a shadow of its former self. Yet Charles's indomitable will remained unbroken. He decided to besiege the small fortress of Poltava on the Vorskla River. The siege was intended to draw the main Russian army into a decisive battle. Peter the Great accepted the challenge, marching his reformed and numerically superior army to relieve the fortress. The Russians established a well-fortified camp a few miles north of Poltava Datwa. Crucially, they constructed a series of redoubts, small, forward forts, to disrupt any Swedish attack. The stage was now set for the final, dramatic confrontation. On the eve of the battle, disaster struck the Swedish command. While reconnoitering the Russian positions, Charles XII was struck in the foot by a sniper's bullet. The wound was severe, incapacitating the warrior king and preventing him from leading his men in person. Command was delegated to Field Marshal Renskiöld, a capable but less inspirational leader, The Swedish plan was to launch a surprise attack at dawn, overwhelming the Russians before they could form up. It would punch through the line of redoubts and smash the Russian army in its camp. On the morning of June 27th, the Swedish infantry advanced with their characteristic courage. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but their morale was still high. The initial assault on the redoubts was partially successful, with two being quickly overrun. However, the Russian defenders in the remaining redoubts fought with unexpected tenacity. The Swedish advance became disorganized as units got bogged down and separated in the smoke. Peter the Great, observing from his camp, saw his opportunity. He unleashed his main force, a vast, disciplined wall of infantry. The Russian artillery, vastly superior in number and quality, opened a devastating fire. The ground shook as hundreds of cannonballs tore through the Swedish ranks. Two main lines of infantry finally clashed in a brutal, close-quarters struggle. For a moment, the elite Swedish soldiers held their ground through sheer valor. But numbers, firepower, and exhaustion began to tell. The Russian line did not break. It pushed forward relentlessly. The Swedish left flank collapsed, and the rout began. Charles XII, watching from a stretcher, tried in vain to rally his fleeing troops. The battle turned into a massacre. Remnants of the Swedish army were pursued relentlessly by the Russian cavalry. A few days later, at the river crossing of Pervalokna, the bulk of the surviving Swedish army surrendered. Over 10,000 men laid down their arms, a catastrophic end to a once glorious army. Charles XII, along with Mazeppa and a small retinue, managed a desperate escape to the Ottoman Empire. The Battle of Poltava was over. Its consequences were immediate and profound. For Sweden, it was a national catastrophe from which it would never fully recover its great power status. The myth of Swedish invincibility was shattered forever. For Russia, Poltava was a glorious triumph, a birth certificate for its new status as a European empire. Peter the Great's reforms were vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible. The victory secured Russia's access to the Baltic Sea, the window to Europe that Peter so desperately craved. The construction of his new capital, St. Petersburg, could now proceed without threat. The Great Northern War would continue for another 12 years, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted from Stockholm to St. Petersburg. The Swedish prisoners of war were paraded through the streets of Moscow in a grand triumphal procession. Many of these prisoners would play a significant role in the development of Siberia and other parts of Russia. The fate of Ivan Mazeppa was a tragic one. He died in exile shortly after the battle. His dream of an independent Ukraine was crushed, and Russian control over the region tightened. Charles XII would spend years in the Ottoman Empire, a guest and sometimes a prisoner, trying to orchestrate a comeback. He eventually returned to Sweden, but he was a changed man, leading a now impoverished nation. He would die in battle a few years later, bringing the Swedish age of greatness to a definitive close. Peter the Great, however, would continue to reign for many years, solidifying his reforms and expanding his empire. The victory at Poltava became a cornerstone of Russian national identity and military pride. It was a testament to the resilience of the Russian people and the vision of their Tsar Gark. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, with infantry, cavalry, and artillery working in concert. Russia's use of defensive fortifications to bleed an attacker was a lesson studied by future military commanders. The logistical nightmare faced by the Swedes served as a stark warning about the challenges of campaigning in Russia. Poltava was more than a battle. It was the violent birth of a new European order. The old power of the North, Sweden, was eclipsed by the rising power of the East, Russia. The echoes of the cannons at Poltava would reverberate through the corridors of European history for centuries to come. Political landscape of the Baltic was redrawn not with ink, but with blood and iron. The Swedish dream of a pan-Baltic empire died in the fields of Ukraine. The Russian dream of a place among the great powers of Europe was triumphantly realized. The battle began under a hazy summer sky, pregnant with impending violence. Swedish soldiers, though weakened, advanced with the discipline for which they were famous. Their blue and yellow uniforms contrasted sharply with the green landscape. The Russian army waited, a silent, dark green mass of men and steel. Peter the Great rode among his troops, his presence a source of immense inspiration. He wore the simple uniform of a colonel, sharing the danger with his men. The first clash was a cacophony of musket fire, cannon roars, and human cries. Smoke quickly obscured the battlefield, creating a confusing and terrifying environment. Communication broke down, and commanders struggled to control their formations. The Russian redoubts acted as breakwaters, channeling and disrupting the Swedish assault. The Swedish infantry, lacking sufficient artillery support, paid a heavy price for every yard gained. The Russian infantry, well supplied with ammunition, maintained a steady, rolling fire. The tide of the battle turned when the main forces engaged on the open plain. It was a contest of Russian numbers against Swedish valor. Swedish cavalry, once the terror of Europe, could not find an opening to charge effectively. The Russian cavalry, by contrast, was used effectively to harass and pursue. The collapse of the Swedish line was not a sudden break, but a slow, agonizing disintegration. First, men began to waver, then to fall back, and finally to run. The sight of their fleeing comrades broke the will of those still fighting. Peter's hat was pierced by a bullet during the battle, a testament to his proximity to the fighting. The victory celebration in the Russian camp was ecstatic and riotous. Peter famously toasted his captured Swedish teachers in the art of war. The surrender at Perevalokna was a scene of profound humiliation for the Swedes. Their colorful banners were laid at the feet of the victorious Russians. The news of Poltava spread like wildfire across Europe, stunning courts and chancelleries. The established political order had been turned on its head. Nations that had feared Sweden now saw an opportunity. The anti-Swedish coalition was revived with new vigor. The war was far from over, but its central character had been irrevocably weakened. Russia's victory was a product of patience, reform, and brutal sacrifice. Peter had learned from his defeats and built an army capable of winning. The battle became a legend, a story told to inspire future generations of Russians. It symbolized the triumph of collective effort over individual genius. Fields of Poltava, once a scene of carnage, returned to peaceful agriculture. But the memory of the great battle remained, buried in the soil. The sun set on the Swedish Empire. The sun rose on the Russian Empire. The Great Northern War had been a long and brutal affair. It had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and devastated entire regions. But for Russia, the prize was immense, a new destiny as a world power. The road from Moscow to St. Petersburg was paved with the lessons of Poltava. The battle was a brutal crucible, forging a new nation in its fires. The courage of the common Russian soldier had been tested and proven. Their steadfastness in the face of the Swedish charge was the key to victory. The Swedish army, for all its bravery, was an instrument of a bygone era. It relied on shock and awe, which failed against a prepared and disciplined foe. Peter's new army represented the future of warfare, a synthesis of firepower, engineering, and discipline. The legacy of Poltava is a story of ambition, failure, and the violent birth of an empire.